Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining. My name is Stephen Friedfeld, and we're going to mainly do a Q&A tonight. Thank you all for sending in advance your questions. I think we received something like 200 questions before tonight, and I just wanted to wait one more minute because I know that we have literally hundreds of people are joining us as we speak in the next minute or so. And just to give you a quick update, if you did not see the message earlier, all of our participants are muted, but you certainly can ask questions as you think of them. We've gotten lots of questions in advance, so I'll get to lots of those. And this recording will be sent to you via email tomorrow. So if you want to take notes, you're more than welcome to, of course, but if you don't get a chance to take notes, just watch the recording tomorrow as well. So let's see. Oh, the last comment that I had is that my colleague is actually joining me behind the scenes, and she is going to answer lots of your questions as well. So I will hopefully get a chance to answer questions, but my colleague will try to do so. She'll try and keep up with everyone. So let's get started. I have a brief presentation, and then we'll get to the Q&A section. And let's see, hopefully my screen advances. Just a little bit about AcceptU. We are a partner of NSHSS, and we're so grateful and thankful that they promoted our webinar. So AcceptU is an admissions counseling group, and all of our counselors are former university admissions officers, and we provide one-on-one virtual counseling. So for younger students who are in grades 9 and 10, we help them with the planning process, thinking about which classes to take and perhaps which extracurriculars to join, and thinking about maybe what their summer activities might look like, and even thinking about what their standardized testing schedule will look like as well. For older students, grades 11 and 12, we start thinking about the kinds of universities that they might want to visit, and we start thinking about the universities that they're shortlisting, and we also talk about strategies. Are you applying to a university in early action or early decision or rolling decision? We also, of course, help students with their essays and applications. And so our company has been around for 10 years. This month is actually our 10-year anniversary, and we were actually founded as a virtual company. Nowadays, obviously, everyone has to work virtually. That's been our MO since we were founded in 2010. And our counselors are all over the country. I think we have counselors living in about 20 or 25 states around the US. And we've had clients from all over the world. Last year, I believe we had clients and students in about 35 states and 20 countries. So our virtual nature allows us to work with students regardless of their location and regardless of the universities to which they are applying. Our team, as I mentioned, is comprised entirely of former university admissions officers, and we have a combined 250 years of experience. And we've read literally tens of thousands of applications, and it puts us in a great position to help our students position themselves when they're submitting their applications and writing their essays and conducting their interviews. A little bit about me. I am an alumnus of Cornell University, and then I received a master's degree from Columbia University's Teachers College, which is their graduate school of education. And then I have a PhD from Rice University. And after school, I then went to work at Cornell, my alma mater. I was there for 4 years in undergraduate admissions. And then afterwards, I went down to Princeton University, where I worked for 6 years in graduate admissions. I then worked independently in admissions consulting and counseling for 4 years before co-founding this company, AcceptU. And as I mentioned earlier, all of our counselors are former admissions officers. Some of our counselors have worked in small liberal arts and sciences colleges, and I'll talk about those later today. Some of our counselors have worked in large public research institutions. Some have worked at the Ivy League, which we'll talk about tonight, and some have worked at other private medium-sized universities. So our wealth and breadth of experience allows us to, as I said, help students position themselves better in the admissions process. Over the last 10 years, we've worked with students on more than 55,000 hours of admissions counseling, and it helps us help students position and guide themselves to differentiate themselves in the admissions process. Just a little bit about our services. We know that we'll anticipate getting a lot of questions if people wanted to work with one of our counselors. We've listed here some of our pricing and our programs for 12th graders. So if you have a 12th grader at home, you might be interested in our essay only package. Some people are instead interested in working with us for an hourly package where they work with us for 10 hours. And then if they use up those 10 hours, they might continue on for an 11th or 12th or 13th hour. And then some students want to work with us in a comprehensive basis where we don't actually track the hours and it's all inclusive, and then our counselors and our students work together. Sometimes it honestly, surprisingly, can take 20 or 30 hours of work for students to complete their applications and their essays, especially for those students who are applying to highly selective universities. If you're applying to highly selective universities, you might have many more essays to complete. And we'll talk about that over the next, say, 20 minutes, and then we'll get to the Q&A. As you can see here on the screen, we also work with students who are in grades 9, 10, and 11. So contact us or visit this website to see what the options are for our students who are younger. And they're very similar packages. And we always want to work with students as early as possible. So I think that anytime in 9th grade, students and parents might think that's too early, but there is a lot that 9th graders can think about with regard to their course selection, with regard to their summer activities, with regard to their standardized testing preparation. Most of our students, admittedly, will work with us in grades 10 or thereafter 11 and 12. So contact us, or we'll contact you to figure out if you're interested in working with us on a consulting basis. We're happy to set up a consultation. So what are we here to talk about tonight? What is the Ivy League? I like to actually broaden it and say that we're not really just talking about the Ivy League, we're also thinking about other highly selective universities. So we'll talk about the actual Ivy League, we'll talk about other selective universities, we'll talk briefly about what the admissions process is like, and then we'll get to Q&A. And as I said, I've already received probably 150 to 200 questions in advance of this webinar, and I know that my colleague who's behind the scenes tonight, she's looking already and answering questions as they come in. So feel free to chat with her if you have questions that unfortunately I'm not able to get to. Oops. Okay, so this is just a transition slide. What is the Ivy League? I probably find myself saying this about once a week. When people say, I want to go to an Ivy League university, I actually really have to have them take a step back and explain that the Ivy League is an athletic league. That is honestly, genuinely what it is. So you can go to a great university and that great university might not be in the Ivy League. What that means is that great university just competes in athletics against other schools. So the Ivy League is an athletic league. There are 8 universities. I'll show what they are on the next screen. And these universities are historic, and the oldest one is Harvard, and the youngest is Cornell. And Harvard, I think I'm going to get this right, was founded in 1636, and Cornell was 1865. So there's about 230 years that separate the youngest and the oldest of the Ivies. But they are institutions that have a fantastic reputation, a lot of research at the highest level, and of course, they are an athletic league. So what are the Ivy League universities? As you can see on your screen here, and I'm just going to click on this to make sure. Yep, so my screen is advancing, which is great. In New York State, there's Cornell in upstate New York, and then Columbia University in New York City. In the Mid-Atlantic states, you'll have University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, Princeton University in Princeton, New Jersey. And then in New England, there's 4 additional. We have Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island, Yale University in New Haven, Connecticut, and then in Upper New England, we'll have Harvard University in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and Dartmouth College, which is in Hanover, New Hampshire. And I actually think that it's a little bizarre, to be honest, when a student applies to all 8 Ivy League universities. You might see one or two news stories every year where it's very exciting and the student has gotten into all 8 Ivy League universities and then perhaps a few additional universities. The reason I think that is a little bizarre is because to me, the Ivy League universities are very different. I think that they are very unique and they don't necessarily have a lot in common other than enjoying a fantastic academic reputation, and they're very highly selective. And like I said, they have great teaching and great research opportunities for students. But take, for example, Dartmouth College. Dartmouth is only about 5,000 or 6,000 students total between its undergraduate and graduate populations versus Columbia University, which is in Upper West Side of Manhattan. So to me, and they have about 6,000 undergraduate students and maybe, let's say, 18,000 graduate students, totaling around 24,000. My numbers might be slightly off, but it'll give you a sense that a university in rural New Hampshire that's about 6,000 or so students, how is that the same as a university in Manhattan that has 20-something thousand students? They're very different. So to me, I always think it's a bit bizarre when a student applies to both Dartmouth and Columbia, and I can do this with any of the other combinations because the universities are very unique, they're different, and I think it's really worth visiting the universities online. And of course, when we're allowed to travel and visit universities and their tours and information sessions open up again, you should visit the universities in person. And that's not, of course, true of just the Ivy League universities. If you have a 9th or 10th or 11th grader at home, you should be visiting as many universities as possible. As I said, at this point, just visit the universities online to see if they have the academics that interest you, to see if they have the majors that interest you, to see what the town is like, what the campus looks like, because every university will present something different. So these are the 8 Ivy League universities. And I also, though, want to point out many other universities. And we call them Ivy Plus. Some people call them Ivy Peer institutions. What I mean is that they are just like the Ivy League in that they are fantastic universities, as it says here, similar admit rates, academics, reputations, but they compete with other institutions and with athletics. So this is just a small sample. I would probably venture to say that there maybe are 50 or so universities across the US that I would consider, quote, Ivy League-like or Ivy peers or Ivy equivalent. So when someone says, I want to go to an Ivy League school, I find it very limiting because that student then is only looking at 8 universities. That doesn't make sense given there's 2,000 universities across the country and probably 50 of those 2,000, or maybe it's even 75 or 100. I don't know the exact number, but 50 or 70 or 100 of them are excellent institutions. And the reality is any university that you go to is a fantastic opportunity for you to do well. A student who goes to, let's say, Harvard University and then does not do well academically is not going to get any opportunities to go to graduate school or business school or medical school or law school. But a student who goes to a local university or a small university or perhaps a university that most people have not heard of outside of that given geography, if that student gets a 4.0 or a very high GPA, that student can go to one of the top 5 or top 10 institutions. As I mentioned earlier, not only do I have experience in Cornell University undergraduate admissions, but I also worked at Princeton University in graduate admissions. And so I saw this every year for my 6 years that I was there. Well, we would see students who had 4.0s or 3.8s or 3.9s and fantastic letters of recommendation, and maybe they had a great summer research project. Those students were getting into our Princeton University graduate programs, and we were rejecting people who went to MIT or Stanford or Harvard. And I'm talking about people whose undergraduate institutions we barely had heard of. So I don't want students to think that where you go for your undergraduate institution dictates everything. And those are some of the questions that I received prior to this webinar. But the reality is no matter where you go, you have to do really well. As a side note, before I talk about these institutions on this screen, there's a great book called Where You Go Is Not Who You'll Be. It was written by Frank Bruni, the New York Times columnist. So again, it's Where You Go Is Not Who You'll Be. And I thought it was a great title. I thought it was a great book. And he talks about the leaders of the Forbes 100 or the Fortune 100 companies, the best 100 or largest 100 companies in the US, especially looking at even the top 10 or top 20, only one of them is headed by someone who went to an Ivy League university. The others were large public institutions. So I, again, don't want you to think that you must go to an undergraduate Ivy League institution to be successful. You can go to any university, do very well, and have great success thereafter. So, well, let's look at these institutions before we move on. The first category are liberal arts and sciences colleges. And you might be surprised to hear me talk about why these colleges would be considered Ivy peers. But the reality is a liberal arts college, as many people call it, and I call it liberal arts and sciences college, that's basically a college that does not have graduate programs or graduate schools. Some of them might have one or two graduate programs, but for the most part, let's say 90% or 95% of the students at a liberal arts and sciences college are there for the undergraduate division. Well, the reality is all of you are now in high school. When you apply to college, you're not applying to graduate school. You're not applying for PhD programs. You're not applying to law school, business school, medical school, dental school, veterinary school, and so forth. So you are, when you're a senior in high school, only applying to an undergraduate division. So you should not summarily discount the smaller liberal arts and sciences colleges because you're not looking to go to graduate school right now anyway. You're looking for a Bachelor of Arts or a Bachelor of Science or a Bachelor of Fine Arts and so forth. But the reality is a smaller liberal arts and sciences college, again, they don't have graduate programs. They're usually much smaller, on the order of between 500 or 600 or 700 students is around the smallest, up to about 2,500 to 3,000 students. Some students thrive in that sort of environment where you are really going to experience very close-knit faculty-student interactions. You'll have more opportunities for leadership within your university because there aren't that many students. There's not 25 or 40,000 students at your school. And you'll probably get to know the students much better as well because it is a smaller, more close-knit community. The liberal arts and sciences colleges, for the most part, you'll find them in more of a college town or maybe in a suburb. Every now and then you'll see a city school. So Macalester College is in Minneapolis, or Barnard College is in New York City, or Occidental College is in Los Angeles. So there are smaller liberal arts colleges that are in major cities, but a lot of them are not, and that might be appealing to you as well. So I've listed here Amherst, which is in Massachusetts, Davidson College in North Carolina, Haverford College in outside of Philadelphia, Pomona College, which is in Claremont, California, just east of Los Angeles, Swarthmore College, also outside of Philadelphia, Wellesley College is outside of Boston, and Williams College is in Western Massachusetts. So these are some fantastics, but this is just a sample. Contact us and we can probably find another 20 fantastic smaller liberal arts and sciences colleges. But let's move on. I also wanted to talk about the private universities, and these are very similar in many ways to the Ivy League, but once again, they just play sports against other universities. So we've listed here Duke University, which is in North Carolina, probably best known for lacrosse and basketball, and then Rice University in Houston, known for baseball. Emory University is in Atlanta, and we've listed Stanford University. Most people think it's an Ivy League school. Same thing with MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Most people think they're Ivies because they're, I would even say, probably better than the Ivy League, or certainly equivalent to the Ivy League universities. We've also listed Vanderbilt University in Nashville and Washington University in St. Louis. So these and a host of other schools are really all very similar in quality and character and admit rates. And I think it just might depend on who you are. Do you want to be at a more Caltech or MIT? Those are institutes of technology. Do you want to be in Silicon Valley? That's where Stanford University is. Do you want to be in a sunny state? If you wanted to be in a sunny weather state, you might look at Emory or Duke or Rice or Vanderbilt, and so on. So again, where you live might determine or might dictate what kinds of universities or the types of universities and the distance of universities from where your home is. And then lastly, the public universities, we often will call these public Ivies. A lot of people will call them that. These are Very selective, very well respected, major research institutions. It's just a handful that we've listed here. University of California at Berkeley, University of California, Los Angeles, or UCLA, University of Michigan, we have UNC Chapel Hill, and then University of Virginia, and then College of William and Mary. Most people actually mistake the College of William and Mary as a private university, almost because it sounds private. All the others are University of, and then the name of a state, but College of William and Mary, it's some might call it technically the second oldest university in the US, and that's in Virginia. It is a public institution. Now, these universities will have more of an obligation to take students who are from those states for the most part. And so it is really very challenging, for example, to get into University of Virginia or University of North Carolina or University of Michigan if you're not from those states. Actually, their acceptance rates are very similar to an Ivy League university. If you're lucky enough to be from one of those states, it's not that it's easy to get in, but there could be some advantage. The only exception to an extent is California. The University of California, especially Berkeley and LA, are so very highly selective that even for Californians, it's very, very challenging to get admitted. So it just gives you a good idea of the types of universities that I'm going to be thinking about and talking about when we do Q&A tonight. What, though, is highly selective admissions? Half of what I'm about to say in the next 10 minutes is probably, hopefully, going to answer the kinds of questions that many of you had asked before this webinar tonight. So what does it mean for a university to be highly selective? Almost always, I should actually say always, the grades and the rigor of your curriculum are going to be first and foremost. You have to have a very challenging curriculum. If you're not challenging yourself, you're not demonstrating or showing or proving to the university that you are capable and able of handling the work and the workload at the university itself, especially if we're talking about highly selective institutions. If your high school offers AP or IB courses, and we have some questions on that that we'll address later. If you have advanced placement courses or international baccalaureate courses that your high school offers, you are not expected to take all the APs or all the IBs offered, but we want you to take a very challenging and rigorous course load as compared to the other college-bound members of your class. So if your high school offers, say, 10 AP classes, and all the top students take 3 by the time they graduate, then you should also similarly take 3. If all the top students take 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 of the 10 classes, then to be honest, if you want to compete very fairly or evenly with those other top students, you should probably also take 5 or 6 or 7 or 8. So the number of AP or IB courses that a student takes will actually change from high school to high school to high school. It really will. Some high schools offer 0 APs and 0 IBs. Well, guess what? Then you're required, or rather expected, to take 0 APs or 0 IBs. You cannot be expected to take courses that your high school does not offer, but we'll come back to that. If your high school does offer 10 or let's say even 20 or 25 AP classes, are you required to take 10 or 20 or 25? Absolutely not. Like I said, you should just take a very challenging curriculum such that it matches the curriculum of your peers who are also very highly ranked in your school or in your class. We want to see an upward trend in your grades. If you did not do that well in 9th grade, that's okay. You still have a shot of getting into a highly selective university, as long as you do much better in 10th grade and then thereafter. In fact, many universities don't even look at your 9th grade marks, and many universities will look at them but take them with a grain of salt. There's a lot of forgiveness for 9th grade marks, but your 10th grade marks are going to be more important than your 9th grade marks, and the most important grades are from 11th grade and 12th grade. 11th grade, because that's the last full year of courses that you'll be presenting to the universities, because if you think about it, you apply in November, December, and January of your 12th grade. Thus, all of your 11th grade marks will be completed by then. Your 12th grade marks are also very important because your senior year curriculum should be the most challenging curriculum. We want you to take a more progressively challenging curriculum as you advance from grades 9 to 10 to 11 to 12. So naturally, your 12th grade marks are going to be, or rather your 12th grade courses should be your most challenging courses, and you should do very well in your 12th grade, even in your first quarter and second quarter Of course, we want you to do well in all of your classes in senior year, but especially the first half of senior year, because that will be judged by the university admissions officers. So if we move on, what else is really important to a highly selective university? I would say that tied for number 2 would be your essays and your standardized exams. This year, however, standardized exams are not going to come into play. So if you are a senior or a parent of a senior and you're listening to this talk, you probably already know that many/most universities, especially the highly selective universities, have really changed their standardized testing requirements or criteria for this year alone, because they know that students are not able to take these exams very readily. Many students have exams that are canceled or postponed indefinitely. If you can take the standardized exams, either the SAT or the ACT, you really should, and you should study hard before taking it so that you maximize your score. Normally, a student can take these exams 2 or at most 3 times. This year, you might only get a chance to take this SAT or ACT once. So you want to make sure that that one time you take it is really a great score for you and is reflective of your abilities. But in a normal year, if you will, the standardized testing, I would say, ranks second, tied second with the essays for what are the most important criteria for getting admitted to a highly selective university. There are not cutoffs, and I know there are questions about GPAs if we go back to the grades and the rigor of curriculum. We mostly want to see A's, A minuses, and A pluses in your grades, but if you get some B pluses every now and then, or even if you get a B every now and then, colleges are not expecting perfection. It's not going to necessarily keep you out, but we want to minimize the B's and lower, as close to 0 B's as possible, and B pluses are fine. They are, but we really want to maximize A minuses and higher. The same thing is true with standardized exams, and that we don't have criteria. The universities don't have an actual quota or a cutoff or a number. So if you get, let's say, a 1,250 out of 1,600 on the SAT, does that mean that you won't get admitted to these Ivy Plus institutions? No, you still have a shot. But admittedly, if you can get closer to, let's say, a 13 or preferably 1,400 or higher, then you're going to have more likelihood of getting admitted. Like I said, there's no cutoff, there's no quota, there's no minimum, but the reality is the farther away you veer from the university standard or the university average, the harder it is for you to get admitted. You'll have to make your case. Have I seen students below the university averages get admitted? Absolutely, I've seen students. And students really need to have a fantastic story, or they might want to have amazing essays. If there's an interview, that should be phenomenal. So if you have some weaknesses on your application, you can compensate for those weaknesses or perceived weaknesses with strengths in other areas of your application. That's what holistic really is getting at. A holistic application means all of the parts of the application are taken into consideration. But the essays are critical. The essays are so important that we have seen students who have perfect grades, perfect scores, perfect everything. And then if they have not written good essays, honestly, the students will probably get waitlisted or rejected if they have perfect everything but terrible essays. I have seen it. So the reality is you want to make sure that your essays are a good reflection of who you are, what your story is, what your potential is, what your interests are academically. There's lots and lots and lots of essay questions that the universities will ask. Usually a very highly selective university will have about, let's say, 1 to 5 essays that you might have to answer for just that one application. The good news is, let's say an application has 2 or 3 essays, then you're writing those 2 or 3 essays for that one university application. You can usually get a lot of mileage out of those essays, meaning you probably can take 1 or 2 of those essays, or maybe all 3 of them, and tailor them or tweak them a little bit to use them as your essays for another university's application. So the good news is, even if you apply to 7 or 8 or 9 universities and each one has 3 essays, you're not likely writing 27 essays, thankfully. You'll probably, though, end up writing 4 to 8 essays, something like that, and then tailoring those 4 to 8 essays to make sense for each of the universities. But those are really critical parts of the application. Otherwise, we want to see an academic interest that I think is unique or interesting. I like to see students who, and this is not quantifiable, of course, but The Ivy League and Ivy peer type institutions are looking for students who are likable. And you can come across as likable based on your essays, based on the letters of recommendation, what others say about you. And you can come across as likable based on your extracurricular profile. And so many students have a very standard extracurricular profile where they all look the same on paper. So if you have interesting and unique and different hobbies or extracurriculars, then that's what you would want to highlight. You'll be memorable. You'll stand out in the application process. The reality is we advise students to have about 4 to 7 extracurricular activities over their 4 years of high school. So 4 to 7 extracurriculars is a good target. It allows us to know who you are and how you spent your time for 4 years. But again, 2 or 3 or 4 years for each of your activities. Admittedly, for highly selective universities, Ivy Plus, as we're calling them, we probably want to see between 6 and 8 or 6 and 9 extracurricular activities. And they can be extracurriculars at school, they can be at home, they can be in your community. So we get lots and lots of questions about what counts as an extracurricular. Practically anything except a generic summer camp and except video games. There you go. The letters of recommendation, one will come from your guidance counselor, or some schools will call it a school counselor. The other 2 letters would likely come from your teachers, but maybe one teacher and then a coach or a clergy person or a supervisor at your job. Those are usually great letters of recommendation. And as it says at the bottom, and as I've said already, all of this is put together to create a holistic reading pattern. So how applications are read, I'll go over this very, very briefly. This changes from university to university to university to university. So it's really just an overview to say, after the students submit their applications, they literally might get tens of thousands of applications. Cornell last year, I think, had 51,000 applicants and they admitted something like 5,300. And the University of California, I'm not sure which campus, but I want to say UCLA, I think had something like 110,000 applications. And most of the University of I shouldn't say most, but probably about 5 or so of the University of California campuses received 90 to 100,000 plus applications. Harvard and probably Columbia and University of Pennsylvania, they're each now receiving probably around 40 to 45,000 applications. So they have to sort them somehow. They usually will sort these applications based on geography and based on academic interest. So if the university has an engineering school and a business school and a college of communications and let's say a music school and so forth, almost always the university will divide those applications into those various schools so that like is compared with like. Apples are compared to apples. If you're applying as a College of Business student, then you're competing with only College of Business applicants and so forth. But usually they have to break them up somehow just to get some semblance of literally thousands, if not tens of thousands of applications. So they usually divide them by geography so that we're competing, or rather comparing one geography from another. It almost doesn't make sense to have someone who is from New York City competing with someone who's from, let's say, rural Kansas, or someone who's from Brazil competing with someone who's from China. They're very different school systems, very different criteria, very different transcripts, and very different opportunities. So we always want to try and read applications geographically. That's almost always the case. Usually it's a one-person screening process who then brings the applications to his or her peers. Sometimes there's 2 or 3 screeners who take up a certain geography, and those people will make yes, no, and maybe decisions. At the very highly selective universities, almost always the decisions are going to be maybe or no, to be quite blunt. Very rarely will an admissions committee say yes to an applicant. Instead, if you'll see the 5th icon here, almost always that person who's in charge of a given geography will then bring all of the maybes applications. The maybes will then go to a committee of 1 more or 2 or 3 people. Sometimes that committee will then deliberate and make yes, no, and maybe piles, and then bring the maybes again to another committee. So after this happens iteratively, then the university will create its freshman class. And let's say a university is looking for say 1,500 students, they'll probably admit about 3,000 students, assuming that about half of those students will enroll at the university and half of them will enroll at another institution. So the universities actually almost all hire externally a statistician or a team of statisticians. Some of the universities have statisticians inside their departments as well to try and figure out how many students should we admit this year. And that number changes. They don't know yet how many applicants they're going to receive. So there's a lot of mathematics going on behind the scenes for universities to make their decisions. If the universities cannot make a decision and they cannot accept a student, but the applicant was incredibly strong, then oftentimes the university will create a waiting list of anywhere from 500 to maybe 2,000 students. I've seen even larger. I personally don't like very large waiting lists, but it is an acknowledgement to the student, the parent, the community, and the college counselor, the school counselor, that the student was very strong and was very close to getting admitted. So now we'll do questions, and I know my colleague has been answering lots of people's questions as they've come in on the chat box, and I can see already there's probably 25 questions there. And like I said, I had received 150 or so questions prior to this conversation. So for the next, let's say 25 minutes, let's do Q&A, and hopefully you'll get something interesting out of this conversation. So I've broken up the 150 questions that I've received. I reduced the redundancy because a lot of people ask the same question, and then I divided them into categories. So one of the first questions, and someone asked, what are some strengths of Ivy League schools? And hopefully I've given some ideas tonight. I think one of the strengths of an Ivy League school is going to be its reputation. Another strength would be its alumni network. And I think another strength typically would be its career services opportunities for students when they graduate to try and get a fantastic job. A lot of companies will be recruiting at those Ivy institutions because they know, in a sense, the university has vetted you already by admitting you. So you want to do very well, but the university will have a great career services opportunity. The universities also have fantastic opportunities for students to then move on to graduate school, and they have a lot of fantastic advising. So for the Ivy League universities, they typically are going to, the students, if you enroll there and do very well, you can, of course, have fantastic opportunities thereafter. But like I said at the beginning, if you do well, no matter where you go, you will have great opportunities. Someone else asked, I thought this was an interesting question. It's not really related to admissions, but I think the students wanted to know, how much time do students spend studying on average if they're at a highly selective university? Well, that's tough to answer, but the students are going to be spending a lot of time studying, and I think it really depends on what the student wants to get out of his or her experiences. I think the student also, or rather this answer also depends on what the major is. Some majors are probably more intensive than others. If you're in a STEM field, for example, you'll probably have a lot more time, not necessarily studying, but a lot more time in a laboratory versus a humanities or social sciences student. The reality is, if students are studying very hard in high school and they're taking very challenging courses, then I think they're preparing themselves to live up to the challenges of the university curriculum as well. Some other questions. One student asked, or parent asked, what are some good topics for a college application essay? And I'm actually going to get a pen so that I could make sure I don't repeat questions here, and I'm going to do check marks. So the reality is, there's not necessarily one good topic for college essays, but as you heard me say over and over again, they are super important. I think that you should almost think of it this way. Any application essay where you're telling more of yourself. I like students who come across as likable. It's not quantifiable, but if you come across as likable, that's valuable. If appropriate, I like students to come across as vulnerable, where they're not putting up a guard, but they're sharing with the admissions officers who they are. It doesn't matter which essay questions you answer. For example, the Common Application gives you 7 essay questions and you only have to choose one, but it's really critical for you, the student, to make sure you're choosing an essay that shows off who you are and what you've accomplished and what kinds of things maybe you want to do with your free time and how you spend your time. I think that it's important to avoid certain essay topics. For example, relationships with boyfriends and girlfriends. We typically, not always, but typically would ask you to avoid those. But I've seen great ones that are related to relationships. Maybe poetry, I strongly would discourage poetry. It does not work as an essay unless the university is asking for you to be creative and specifically and explicitly says, feel free to write a poem. Tufts University is also an Ivy peer, as we would call them. Tufts University outside of Boston, many years, I don't know if they're doing it this coming year, but for many years they've said, be creative and feel free to write a poem. University of Chicago, also an Ivy Plus institution that I just didn't get a chance to mention or name on our screen. The University of Chicago always has a very, very interesting and I would say challenging essay that is really going to be oftentimes creative. And so if that is if you like a creative essay, then those institutions that I just mentioned might make sense for you. I would also not necessarily avoid politics and religion, but be careful, be cautious if you're writing about politics and religion on your application. You never know who is reading your application. Is this person 24 and just graduated 2 years ago from this institution? Or is this person 65 and a retired physics professor and doesn't get what you're saying in your application? So just keep in mind, you don't know if that person's 24 or 65. You don't know the gender, the politics, the religion, the interests of that reader, and presumably you'll have multiple readers on your application. So you want to make sure that your essay is universally likable, no matter if your grandparents are reading your essay or your little brother is reading your essay. I think those are, for the most part, the topics that I would avoid. I like to put it in those terms rather than say you should write X or Y or Z. One other question, or a few questions came in. I'll go to the curriculum section. Someone asked, do schools recognize, and they mean, do these universities recognize or value the International Baccalaureate Diploma Program, the IB diploma? The answer is yes. In fact, if I had to weight an IB program versus an AP Advanced Placement program, I'd give slight preference to the IB diploma. So if you're at a high school that gives you the chance, or rather choice, to take either an IB curriculum or an AP curriculum, I might encourage you to lean more towards the IB curriculum, but I think you'd get more flexibility from the AP. So there's not one right answer, unless, as I said earlier, just make sure you're taking a very challenging curriculum. I also want you to take a curriculum that's right for you. If you're going to be applying as a mechanical engineer, then I do think it's important for you to take the most challenging physics and computer science and calculus classes. If you're going to be applying as, let's say, a history major, then take US history, European history, human geography, and world history at the highest level. So you just want to make sure that your academic schedule matches what you want to study in college. You're not locked into your major. When you apply to a university, they'll give you 1 or 2 or 3 drop-down category boxes where they're saying to us, please let us know what major you might want to study. You're not declaring your major, you're just indicating to the university that this is the major I think I want. Someone else asked, about interviews. Okay, so that's a good point for me to bring up right now. What are the most frequently asked questions in a college interview? Well, the reality is, if you're applying to those smaller liberal arts and sciences colleges, they will probably have, almost certainly they'll have, an optional interview. And if you do consider yourself a strong interviewer and you have something to say, then I think you should go for the interviewer. If you don't think your strength is in interviewing, it actually will be held against you. So in that case, if it's an optional interview, I would not go for the optional interview. That's something that, if you worked with AcceptU, our company, we would certainly want to give you a mock interview or 2 if you are going for a university interview. For the other colleges that I've listed, the large public Ivies, as we call them, UNC Chapel Hill and University of Michigan and so forth, they will not have an interview. So you don't have to worry about that. But the middle private-sized universities and the Ivy or Ivy Plus, many/most of them will actually do something called an alumnus interview. Technically, it's not an interview. but they haven't come up with a better name for them. It's probably more like an information session. It's an opportunity for you, the student, to meet with the alumnus who lives local to your area. Usually you'd meet in a coffee shop. This year, I'm sure everything is going to be done virtually, of course, but you meet with someone local, and that person who's an alum just tells you about his or her experiences at the university, and they want to get to know you more as well. What are your interests? What are your hobbies? What are your extracurriculars? Why are you applying to this university? So those are the kinds of questions that typically you'll get asked in an alumnus interview. Those interviews, for the most part, are really not evaluative. So if you do meet an alumnus at a coffee shop or online virtually, that interview technically should not be evaluative, meaning the alumnus is just sharing her experiences at the university and then writing up your answers and sending those answers to the university. But for the most part, it's more informational. If, however, you do a bad job on that alumnus interview, then it can become evaluative and no longer just informational. So you want to make sure your interview is good or great, so that it does not become evaluative in a negative way. Some questions came in about athletics. Some people asked, one person asked, do I have to be an athlete to get into an Ivy League school? The answer is absolutely not. In fact, most of the universities, if I'm not mistaken, the 8 Ivy League universities probably will admit about 250 or so students, 200 to 250 students each year who are recruited athletes. So Cornell is the largest of the Ivy League undergraduate divisions. It's not the largest Ivy League university, but Cornell has the largest undergraduate IB population. So they're looking for a freshman class of about 3,000 each year. And so 200 to 250 students out of 3,000, my math is probably off, but what is that? 7% of the freshman class are recruited athletes at Cornell, meaning 93% of the class is not. Dartmouth is probably looking for about 200 athletes. It's a smaller school. So out of their 1,000 freshmen each year, I don't know that my numbers are right, but let's assume they are. If 200 students are recruited athletes, then that is a very high percentage, 200 out of the 1,000 at Dartmouth. And I'm probably high, but I don't know that 20% of the freshman class at Dartmouth, but that would be the largest percentage, I would say. So again, 80% of the students are not going to be recruited athletes even at Dartmouth, which perhaps does have a very large percentage of athletes on its campus. So you don't have to be recruited to get into an Ivy League university, but it can help, certainly. It will help. And you don't necessarily know if you're an official recruit. Let's just use an example. If a university team is looking for 10 or so students, that coach is probably going to recruit about, let's say 20 or even 35 students, hoping that 10 of them will enroll. So you might think that you're officially one of the 10 recruits for that coach, but in reality, only 10 of those 30 students are official recruits, and the other 20 are not recruits officially, even though they've had conversations with the coach. So it is a very, very tricky conversation. And in fact, we have 2, or I would say 3 now, folks on our team at AcceptU who are athletics admissions experts. It's a very, very different process. But if you are strong enough athletically to get admitted, or rather to get recruited at an Ivy or Ivy Plus institution, it can help. I don't know the percentage or the factor, but it can help tremendously in getting admitted. You still have to have very strong grades and very strong marks and very terrific extracurricular activities, but admittedly, there's a lot more forgiveness. So instead of Brown University, for example, most of the students at Brown University probably have a 33, 34, 35 on their ACT. I know of a recruited athlete who had a 30, I can't recall, 30 or 31. That is still a phenomenal score because 36 is the highest, but it's not quite as high as the others. But that student is going to contribute in many ways to the university. So they say, well, you're recruiting, or rather you're contributing as an athlete. Maybe we don't need you to have a 33 or higher. You still have great scores and great grades. Someone else asked, oh, what are the acceptance rates for a student athlete at an Ivy League institution? I don't really know the answer to that. I don't know that that's publicly made available. But when that college admissions scandal came out a year and a half ago, what was revealed is that 86% of students who were recruited to Harvard University were then admitted. So that's what I was getting at earlier is you might not get recruited. Most people do not get recruited, but if you do get recruited, then you have a really good chance of getting admitted. You might say, oh, well, then maybe I'll just work on my athletics to get recruited. Well, it's not 100% of students who are recruited who get in. It was 80-something%. The reality, though, is a university like Harvard is not even going to bother recruiting you if you don't have a certain type of standardized test scores or certain grades and so forth. So the coaches are doing a lot of vetting even before your application is ever brought in front of the admissions committee. Someone else asked related to COVID, given that a lot of the entering freshmen, meaning the high school class of 2020, is going to be taking a gap year, will this increase the difficulty for the class of 21, meaning the rising seniors? The answer is it's hard to know. We're not quite sure. In fact, we had a panel discussion just a week ago. My company had a panel discussion, and we spoke for an entire hour on this very topic. So I can't answer in just 30 seconds appropriately, but the reality is we do think that at a lot of the highly selective institutions, we are seeing that at Harvard, for example, 20% of its freshman class has requested and received a deferral. So they probably are, I don't know that they're taking 20% fewer students next year, but the reality is it can squeeze out some seniors. It could be harder. Some universities, I think Williams College in Massachusetts, that was listed on the, it's a top 5 national liberal arts and sciences college. Williams, I think about 15% of its student body is going to be requesting or has requested and received a 1-year gap or 1-year deferral. So most of the universities probably are going to be having a 5 to 10% of their student body is taking a gap year or a deferral year. So that could make it more difficult or challenging or selective for the universities, or rather for students who are seniors to get into the universities. So I'm not saying this to scare anyone, but we are expecting more students, unfortunately, to apply to more universities. We usually advise students to apply to 6 to 10 universities. I imagine a student who would normally have applied to 6, she might apply to 8. A student who would normally have applied to, let's say, 10 universities, he might apply to 12 universities. So students might be hedging their bets a little bit and adding 1 or 2 more universities on their list. A lot of questions came in related to admissions criteria, so I will address some of these. Someone asked if my GPA is not perfect, but I have a lot of extracurricular activities and community service hours, do I still stand a chance of getting admitted to an Ivy Plus institution? Well, as I mentioned earlier, you don't need a perfect GPA, but we want to see an upward trend in your GPA. In colleges at the highly selective institutions, we actually never looked at the GPA. I swear I never looked once at the numerical GPA when someone was applying to my institutions, simply because the GPA calculation changes from high school to high school to high school to high school. So if you have a 3.9, I genuinely don't know what a 3.9 GPA means, because I don't know if it's weighted or unweighted. I don't know if it's out of 4.0 or 4.5 or 5.0. So a 3.9 out of 4.0 is really great. A 3.9 out of 5 or 6.0 is less great. So the numerical GPA doesn't matter, but we want to see mostly, as I said, A minuses, A's, and A pluses. Yeah, so if you don't have a perfect GPA, that's okay as long as there's an upward trend in your grades and in the rigor of your curriculum. I love to see a lot of extracurriculars, but not too many. I've seen a student with 22 extracurricular activities taking up a 4-page resume. That's insane. That's absurd. It's actually, I don't want to say it's an automatic rejection, but a student who has too many extracurricular activities, the college doesn't get a chance to know who the applicant is. If you have 4, 5, 6, 7 extracurriculars, then I know who you are. I get a good sense. But if you have 20 plus extracurriculars, it just looks like you were joining extracurriculars for the sake of joining extracurriculars, and you're not getting involved in any meaningful way. It does not show continuity or commitment or dedication to a more select number of extracurriculars. So for the student who asked this question, I'm glad that you have a lot of extracurriculars, but I hope it's not too many. And I hope your GPA is not being suffered or sacrificed for the sake that you're having so many community service hours and extracurriculars. I do want to also mention community service hours. I see that question probably once or twice a week. So we're talking 50 to 100 times a year, I get this question where parents will say, my son or daughter does not have community service hours, will she get into college? Yes, there's no university. I mean, there probably are 2 or 3 universities out of 2,000 that have a community service hour requirement, but for the most part, no university actually requires community service. And so if you don't have community service, then don't do community service and you'll still get into universities. If you have community service, great. I love to see that. It shows a lot about you and your character and how you spend your time, but if you don't like community service or you don't have an opportunity time-wise to participate, that's fine too. So you don't have to participate in athletics. You don't have to participate in community service to get admitted. Show me a university that requires these things, and then sure, that might be the exception. I mean, one quick exception might be the service academies. So the US Naval Academy, the US Air Force Academy, the US Military Academy, those, I'd have to look, but those schools probably / possibly might have an athletics requirement, but no other school will have that. Some other people have asked, well, I've addressed the SAT and ACT requirements, so I don't want to repeat. Someone said, oh, what are some extracurricular activities I can participate in to make my applications stand out? It's a great question. You know, there's lots of categories. If you apply to a university that uses the common application, there's actually 29 drop boxes, 29 categories, and they range from theater and drama to community service to babysitting and home, home help, and to getting a job outside of home, athletics, the arts. There is no right set of extracurricular activities. I personally, though, like when students do an extracurricular activity that's different and unique and will be memorable and stand out. So if you're on the soccer team or the dance team or chorus, those are great. Participate in those. If you like those things, do those for 2 or 3 or 4 years. I'm going to probably be expecting that you have some more quote unquote standard extracurriculars on your resume. But what if you taught yourself the German language at home for the last 2 years? What if you taught yourself French cuisine cooking for a year or 2? What if you taught yourself how to play the guitar? What if you joined a garage rock band in your local town? What if you taught elementary school students a particular skill like karate or some other martial arts? Those are the kinds of things that I think are interesting and unique and memorable, and that I'm not going to see on every single application. If you're looking to go to a highly selective university, and obviously if you're on this webinar, that's probably on top of your mind, yeah, then you might want to do a more academic extracurricular activity. You probably don't have time except during the summer, but I would look during the summer to do something like a community college course or a course at a university. They have a lot of university courses for high school students during the summer. You might also want to do something like a research project at a local university, or even on your own with one of your teachers as you're an advisor. You might want to do an independent study research project in your senior year under the guidance of one of your teachers. So there are a lot of summer programs that are, let's say, if you're interested in speech and debate, there are a lot of debate camps. There's leadership camps. If you're interested in business, there's business plan competition camps for high school students. So any or all of these things are actually really interesting, and they're memorable, and they actually demonstrate a real interest and dedication and commitment to whatever you want to study in college. Even if you don't want to be a German literature major, just by virtue of the fact that you're studying German and teaching yourself German, to me, that's interesting. It shows you're intellectually curious and intellectually inquisitive, and you've taken the initiative to learn a new language or learn a new culture. In the interest of time, I see that we're at 1 hour, and hopefully a lot of you have gotten your questions answered by my colleague who's been diligently answering questions all along. And I just have a few more that I'll address. Just for fairness, I know that people submitted lots and lots of questions. Someone did ask about demonstrating interest when it comes to admissions, and I just mentioned that phrase. How do you demonstrate interest in your major? Well, like I said, research or a summer class or a camp, that's a summer camp related to what you want to study. There's also something called demonstrated interest in the university. So if you are looking at a smaller college, like those smaller liberal arts and sciences colleges, you really should demonstrate interest in them. They're more likely to admit someone who has actually expressed an interest. if they're weighing between two applicants and both applicants look fantastic, but one has visited campus twice and has done an overnight hosting program and the other one has never been to campus, they're going to admit the one who has demonstrated interest in that university because they feel like if we admit student number one might enroll. Student number two, I have no idea if he'll enroll or not. So for smaller colleges, you should visit them if possible when visits are allowed. You should take them up on the interview if you think you'll do well, because that demonstrates interest. If they visit your town or your area or your region, you should go visit the admissions officers who are visiting locally and introduce yourself. They usually will rent out a hotel ballroom, and there usually will be 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 institutions, universities that travel together. So it's a great way for you to express interest to that institution, or plural to many institutions. If you go to these university websites right now or in 5 minutes and then click on the admissions page, there's almost always a button or a link where you can enter your name, your phone number, your zip code, and your email address. And what that does is it alerts the university. If they visit your zip code, you'll get an automated email that says, we are going to be in your region, come hear us talk. And that demonstrates interest. Universities are trying to figure out, if they admit you, will you enroll? At the end of the day, it's very much based on numbers. If a university is looking, like Cornell, where I used to work, they're looking for 3,000 freshmen, and we admitted about 5,500, sometimes 6,000 freshmen. Will 3,000 of them enroll, or will we get only 2,700 of them enroll, or will we get 3,300 to enroll? They want to try and get it as right as possible, and they are trying to figure out if you are likely to enroll. Few other questions and then I'll let you go. Someone asked, how can I narrow down my college search when I don't know what I want to major in? That's a great question. As I mentioned earlier, you don't need to know your major until your freshman year, actually your sophomore year of college, usually towards the end of your sophomore year. But if you're applying to a highly selective university, it is beneficial, admittedly, to give the university 1 or 2 or 3 ideas of what you think you might want to major in. If you're truly and clearly undecided, admittedly, probably the smaller liberal arts colleges are going to be more forgiving for undecided students who just don't know what they want to major. But taking challenging classes in high school will absolutely give you some ideas of what you like and what you don't like. It'll give you some ideas of what your strengths are, and that could be a really great way to try and figure out what you want to major in. My company actually offers something called I Start Strong. It's the Myers-Briggs test, but for high school students. It helps you figure out 5 different majors that you might like. It even lists 25 additional majors in descending order that might be right for you. And your extracurricular activities can help you figure out what you want to major in. If you do an extracurricular activity, like I said, a business plan competition camp during the summer, and you love it, then you're probably going to be an economics or business major. If you don't like it, that's okay, then that's probably not the right major for you. So these summer programs after 10th grade and 11th grade can really help students figure out what they want to major in. But then your question was, how do I narrow my college search? Well, once you start to figure out what you want to major in, there's a lot of criteria that can be taken into account when you're searching for a university. Distance from home, cost, location, as in geography and climate, setting, meaning urban and rural and suburban and college town, size of the university, do they even offer a few majors that might interest you? So there are so many factors. There's others, and we have a survey for our students for them to complete, so we help them figure out what do they like and not like in an institution. Are you interested in a university that's liberal or conservative? Are you interested in a university that has a very active, politically active student body? Are you interested in Greek life? Are you interested in a university that's very strong in athletics as well as academics? So those are the sorts of criteria that we think make sense for you, the student, to investigate. And then I guess one last, this is actually a good place to finish. A few questions came in about financial aid and scholarships. So the Ivy League universities, those 8 Ivies that play athletics against each other, they actually do not award as a group. This was their decision probably 30 years ago. They do not award merit-based scholarships. They do not award athletic scholarships. So the Ivy League universities, those 8 institutions, they only award financial aid based on your need. So if your family needs the money, then you will receive it from those institutions. They're very wealthy, very well-endowed institutions. And if your family can afford to pay $5,000 a year, great. Then you'll get the other $65,000 given to you. If your family can afford to pay $40,000 a year, but it costs $70,000, then those universities will give you the difference, $30,000. They're not handing it to you, they are giving you a few options. One is loans, and they'll try and make your loans as minimal as possible. Most of the gap, as they call it, will be in the form of a grant, which you do not have to pay back. And then they'll offer you a job on campus so that you can earn some money and help defray the cost. So the Ivies in particular, and the Ivy Plus, those other institutions, are really, the sticker price might shock you to say, oh, it's $50,000+ on tuition alone, and then another $15,000+ for room and board. That's not the price that most people pay. Most people will pay what they can afford. There's a formula, and talk to the university financial aid offices, but all of these universities are 100% need blind, meaning they don't care if your family is worth $100 million or $100. They genuinely don't care. And when I was in admissions, I never cared, never looked, never knew. If a student was wealthy but got in, great. If a student was socioeconomically disadvantaged and the family was not able to pay any money, didn't matter, then he or she got a full ride. It is not going to weigh into the admissibility whatsoever. Now, some of the other universities on that list, I mentioned Vanderbilt University, for example, they have a full ride scholarship that is merit-based. We've had 3 students receive that award. That's $250,000 scholarship. That's insane, but we've had 3 students win. University of Virginia, University of North Carolina, we've had students win those. Full ride, everything is paid for. So there are some of these top universities that have merit-based scholarships, and I actually recommend that students and parents go to finaid.org, FIN, short for financial aid, so finaid.org. I think it's a great website. I learned a lot from it because people in admissions might be sort of related to people in financial aid, but they are almost always different offices and different institutions. They communicate with each other, but they're different. And so I did not know much about financial aid, but I learned a lot from finaid.org. They even have a scholarship search page there. And so I think it's a really great way for us to end this Q&A, for people to realize, look, these universities are within reach financially and academically, as long as the students are really taking a very challenging curriculum and getting very involved with their extracurriculars and writing fantastic essays. I want to thank everyone for your questions. We had 2,000, almost 2,000 people sign up for this webinar. And like I said, we had 150+ questions in advance. And then I want to thank my colleague, Kyle, who was behind the scenes answering question after question after question. So thanks so much to NSHSS for organizing and coordinating this. And we hope to hear from you if you're interested possibly in working with AcceptU on one of our services that I mentioned at the beginning of this conversation. Thanks so much, everyone. I hope everyone has a good night.